Steve. I'm David Draper. I'm a professor of statistics in the Department of Applied Mathematics and Statistics at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And also, I'll be on leave from Santa Cruz from July 1st through December 31st this year. I'll be working full-time at eBay with Tony Thrall and other people at eBay. There are a lot of eBay people in the room, and a lot of Google people in the room, a lot of people from the San Francisco ASA, a lot of people from the Bay Area chapter of the ACM, and it's wonderful to be able to bring us all together to talk about these ideas. The schedule for each day is given on this whiteboard. We'll be having 6 one-hour sessions each day, interspersed with 15-minute breaks and a 1-hour break for lunch. And that will occupy each day from 9 all the way a.m. to 5 p.m. Tonight we have a special event organized by the San Francisco ASA chapter. There's a dinner in our honor, and other people will be coming too, I bet, at the Biltmore Hotel, which is at 2151 Laurelwood Road in Santa Clara. Takes about 20 minutes to drive there from here. Is that what someone told me, roughly? So we'll break promptly at 5 and head down to the social gathering. The webpage for the course has the URL listed here, users.soe.ucsc.edu/tilde-draper/ebay with a capital B -2013.html. And those of you, for the first hour, we're going to be unable to project the content onto this screen over here. So those of you who have laptops in front of you, you could go to the webpage and get the lecture notes that I'll be talking from the webpage. So I'm going to put this out of the way now, and we'll just remember that this is our basic schedule for how the day is meant to unfold. Perhaps I'll begin by orienting you to the course webpage. I realize, having come here this morning, for those of you who are not Google people, that I didn't do a good enough job in describing exactly how to get here, because Beacon Rock is not a phrase that's on the signs out there in the street, is it? So we have this map which tells us where each of these places is. And the thing is that I will put, for the future web pages, I'll update the web page starting tomorrow with the actual Google building names for all of these sites. We are not able to have the course at this particular room on all 10 of its meetings. Instead, we have to go back and forth between 4 meeting places in order to make sure that we can actually get the videotaping done. And also, there is a week in which there's no meeting at all, because I guess it was not easy to find a meeting room with video facilities and this many people that day. So we'll be working 2 weeks in a row, 11 and 18 January. Then we'll have a week off, and then we'll work consistently every Friday from the 1st of February through the 22nd of March. I also know something that I just learned early this morning by email that I can tell you. I have an unavoidable conflict in the late afternoon on the 18th of January. So you saw how these sessions run, sessions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I will have to leave at 2:30 next Friday and go back to Santa Cruz for a meeting that I can't avoid. And so we'll only be having 4 of the 6 one-hour sessions next Friday, the 18th of January. I'll put that on the webpage also. That's the only disruption to the schedule that I'm aware of at present. And so there is a summary of the course content that you can read at your convenience. And I've given a detailed course outline in 7 basic chapters, you might call them. And then I've created an approximate mapping from topics 1 through 7 in red on the one hand to weeks 1 through 10. We're going to be focusing on topic 1 today. I have picked out 2 things that are supplementary readings if you want to go into them a bit as well. One of them is a book by Dennis Lindley, one of the great Bayesians of the 20th century, and he's still alive and going strong at the age of 90-something. Let's see if I turn the lamp off, you can perhaps see it a little better. So this is a book called Understanding Uncertainty in the Wiley series by Dennis Lindley. And as it says here on the web page, a lovely small introductory book filled with excellent Bayesian insights. And then another book that you might be interested in is called Bayesian Data Analysis, second edition, by 4 people. First author, Andrew Gelman, in the Chapman and Hall series. And there's a third book that I'll be talking about next time. Somehow I forgot to put it on the webpage. That I'll bring that and talk about it next time as well. And then all of the handouts for the course are going to be available in PDF format down here at the bottom. And then also later on, the final section will have code of various kinds, data sets and code. I'll be using the freeware statistical computing environment R, the freeware markup chain Monte Carlo Bayesian computing environment WinBugs, and I may sometimes also use the not freeware symbolic computing environment Maple, and I'll be giving code for all of those examples down here at the bottom of the web page, and also data sets that we'll be working from. So that's the web page. Those of you who are over on this side of the room, and for the next hour or so can't see the screen very well, you can go to the course web page and download lecture notes part 1, background and basics, and I'll be talking from that. I've also provided, for those of you who want to do some work in the periods between each of our meetings, I've provided a problem set that accompanies this particular unit of material and solutions to the problem set. And I'll also be writing from some handwritten notes that I will be displaying, if it will ever refresh. I'll be displaying these handwritten notes up here on the document camera as well. I don't know why that's taking so long to load. So you'll have a PDF when you see me display things on the document camera. You'll have a PDF of these notes available to you so that you, that's funny, okay. You'll have a PDF of these notes, handwritten notes, available to you on the website as well. And if from time to time, there will be times when I have forgotten to include things in the handwritten notes, I'll be taking extra notes here in real time on the document camera. And when I'm done today, sometime tomorrow over the weekend, I'll scan these and post them as PDF there as well. So one way to absorb this course would involve potentially no note-taking at all on your part. You basically just focus your attention completely on what I'm doing, and I'm going to try to make sure that all of the resources that you need will be available to you on the web page. Okay, so let's go back to the machine and bring up the first block of material. My preferred style for presenting material to people is interactive. So I certainly would like you guys to be free to ask questions if and when they arise. It's likely that if you have a question, there's someone else in the room who has a similar question, and so it would be great to speak up and ask such a question. And also, if it's okay with you guys, I will ask you questions as well to focus things and have the experience of absorbing the ideas occur in real time rather than simply having it mostly occur by you looking at the notes offline. So if that's all right with you, I'll ask you questions as well. There's no brownie points for getting it right. There's no negative brownie points for getting it wrong. There aren't any right and wrong answers. It's just a chance for us to discuss these ideas as we go along. And you will tell me by your behavior whether you like this style or not. I'll ask these questions, and if no one answers, after a while I won't ask them anymore. And we'll just go to the usual format where I talk for a long time and you listen. But it's much more fun if we get an interaction going. So I hope you'll like the interactive part. Okay, so this material provides a quite thorough introduction. In fact, it's the longest short course I've ever given. The previous record for me was 9 days. at Yahoo some years ago, and we now are going to try to do 10 full days in which we can cover an astonishing range of the Bayesian landscape. We will go all the way from introductory topics through a number of intermediate topics, and we will be able to touch on quite advanced material by the end of the 10 weeks. So we're going to be talking about 4 things: Bayesian modeling, Bayesian inference, Bayesian prediction, and Bayesian decision making. I like to develop material in the context of a series of case studies drawn from my own experience as a scientist and consultant. And my idea is to present the case study to you first, and then we'll pose a question based upon the case study, and we'll spend some time developing a good answer to that question. It's a sort of a 4-step process. So step 1, introduce the case study and understand what the basic question is. Step 2, we work on solving that problem by developing methods. Step 3, we will examine the solution based on those methods and see if we've gotten all the way there, what its strengths and limitations are. And then in step 4, we will talk about, we'll stand back and talk about the broader scope. We've now, quote, invented a method that is useful not just in this case study, but rather more broadly. So let's talk about when it works best and when it doesn't work so well, things of that kind. So basically that's how we're going to go as we go along. Most of my applied work is in medicine, although recently I've been consulting with people at eBay. And so most of the case studies will have a medical nature to them. There's some work in education, because I've also done some publishing in the education field and the physical sciences. And assuming that the people at eBay and I come to an agreement about what it's okay to talk about here, there may well be case studies from eBay material as well. I'm hoping the course is aimed at people who often or at least sometimes use statistics in their research work. And I'm hoping that you have some undergraduate or graduate coursework in probability and or statistics. If you've never heard of Bayes before, that's fine. In fact, that's great. If you have heard a lot about the non-Bayesian approach, the so-called frequentist approach, I'll be contrasting the Bayesian story with the frequentist approach as we go along as well. My view is that anyone who wants to do a good job of quantifying uncertainty in his or her work and in his or her life in the 21st century needs to know quite a bit about both of those paradigms. You need to know how to think like a frequentist. You need to know how to think like a Bayesian. And many of you in the room have already had some training in how to think like a frequentist. I'll be also helping you in this course to think like a Bayesian. And we'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses. It turns out that those 2 probability paradigms have the property that neither one of them uniformly dominates the other. Each one has strengths and weaknesses. Despite the way things were framed in the 20th century, statisticians are a relatively mild-mannered lot. There's a joke that a statistician is someone who doesn't have enough personality to become an accountant. And so we tend to be relatively calm with each other. But there were actually some really nasty shouting matches in the 20th century over what Mr. Neyman, the guy who invented hypothesis testing, used to call Bayesian frequentist controversy. I got to know Mr. Neyman toward the end of his life. I was a grad student at Berkeley when he was just in the last years of his life. The closest thing to shedding of blood in the 20th century among statisticians had to do with the divide, as it was perceived, between the Bayes story and the frequency story. This is, in fact, in my view, a complete misrepresentation of the problem. The frame that people gave this problem back in the 20th century was that one of those paradigms had to be better than the other one, and your job was to figure out which one was the better one and defend it fiercely against attacks from people who preferred the other paradigm. In fact, this is a completely flawed frame for thinking about things because, as I will show you, neither of those paradigms is dominant. Both of them, as I said a moment ago, have both strengths and weaknesses, and so our job, I believe, as statisticians, is to understand them both fully and to try to develop our own fusion of Bayesian and frequentist ideas to create a fusion that maximizes the strengths of the fusion and minimizes the weaknesses. That seems to me to be the way forward. And the fusion that I'm going to offer you in this course is to reason in a Bayesian way when formulating my inferences and predictions and decisions, and then reason in a frequentist way when evaluating the quality of those things. Because there's an important idea in the frequentist story which is not built into the Bayesian story, namely the crucial scientific question of How often does my method for separating signal from noise, how often does that method get the right answer? And that's an inherently frequentist, repeated sampling sort of question. How often does something happen? That's a frequency sort of question. So the frequentist approach has one great strength. It forces us to think about this crucial scientific question: how often does my method get the right answer? I'm going to call that particular topic calibration. So the frequentist story brings us the idea of calibration. And the Bayesian story, the great strength of the Bayesian story, is it brings us internal logical consistency in our methods for learning about the world from data. The frequentist story has gaping internal logical inconsistencies. You can end up in the frequentist story constructing an estimate of a quantity that you know is positive, and the estimator comes out negative. All sorts of ridiculous things like that can happen from the frequentist point of view. That can never happen from the Bayesian point of view. So the fusion I'm going to offer you is to reason in a Bayesian way when doing the things you do, inference, prediction, and decision making. And that brings logical internal consistency to the table. And then reason in a frequentist way when evaluating the calibration properties of the method that you've been using. And that brings calibration, good calibration, to the table. In other words, I believe what we want to be, in one single phrase, is well-calibrated Bayesians. We want to be able to use the Bayesian paradigm because it's more flexible in the frequency story at accurately capturing in a quantitative fashion all relevant sources of uncertainty in the problem that you're working on. But we want to be Bayesians who get the right answer about as often as we announce. I want to be a Bayesian, but I also want and do Bayesian things in my consulting work, but I also want to be a Bayesian who gets invited back again. And if I'm a Bayesian who creates dogmatic answers that turn out to be badly out of step with reality, which is completely possible in the Bayesian paradigm, then I will not get invited back on the next consulting contract. So we have to bring together those two ideas of internal logical consistency on the one hand, which Bayes brings to the party, and calibration, which the frequency story brings to the party. And that's the big picture that I'll be sharing with you in this course. I hope that you will have had some math background. I need you to be comfortable with partial differentiation and integration of functions of several variables. And I need you to be comfortable with discrete and continuous probability distributions of dimensions higher than 1, joint distributions, marginal and conditional distributions. I will review that stuff here today. And in any case, if you're rusty, it's all going to be presented in a sufficiently intuitive manner that I hope that that won't present difficulties. As I said before, extensive details for carrying out the analyses will be posted on the web page and shown in these PDFs here. And I'll be using R, as I said, and Maple and WinBugs. And so text files containing the code that I'll be using and the data sets will be posted on the course web page. And I'll also provide homeworks, problems, and solutions if you want to work on these things in the week in between our meetings. So there's our schedule again. Some of these sessions will be devoted to new material and some to solving problems. So I'll stop sometimes and ask you, did you try any of the homework problems? Do you want to talk about them? How can I help you to understand the solutions to those homework problems? And some of them will be devoted to computer labs. If you would like to follow along on the work we're doing, you will need to download R onto your laptop, and you can run the R programs in real time as I do them here, for example. Those of you who have Macs, WinBugs is unfortunately a Windows program, so you have various solutions available to you, none of them that are really wonderful. You can emulate, right? You can run a Windows emulator, which is really awful. There's a thing called OpenBugs. If you go to Google and type in OpenBugs, you'll get to the OpenBugs project. They are trying to create a port of WinBugs into an environment which is completely machine independent, operating system independent. I don't know how well they've succeeded. I'm mostly a Unix guy myself, and I use Windows because I need to for much of my consulting work, and so WinBugs comes fairly naturally to me. But those of you who are Mac people, you're going to have a harder time with the Bayesian computing here unless you can figure out somehow to get WinBugs to work in your environment, either by the emulation route or the OpenBugs route. There are also some relatively general purpose Markov chain Monte Carlo routines available in the freeware environment R and on this thing called the Comprehensive R Archive Network, and I'll talk about that later as well. Okay, So I'd like to begin with an example to fix many of the ideas that we'll be covering in the entire course. This is based upon a paper that I was part of writing a few years ago. And it, in turn, is based upon a case study that arises from a paper that was published back in the mid-1980s. The lead author of that paper was a Danish doctor named Hendriksen. And the idea was, the basic question here, the policy question here is the following. When you get to be elderly, there are a variety of places you can live. You can live in your own home. When you're sick, you can live in the hospital for a while, and then you hope to get back to your home. Sometimes it's necessary because people aren't able to care for themselves well enough anymore to move from your home to a nursing home, for example, and there are various levels of care in nursing homes. Everybody, I don't know if you ever talked with your father or grandfather or whatever, grandparents or parents or whatever, if they've gotten to this stage, everybody prefers living at home. You want to stay in your own home as long as possible. So going to the nursing home, going to the hospital, these are both examples of being institutionalized, and we would like to prevent institutionalization when it's not necessary. That was the goal of this experiment. So they invented an intervention called in-home geriatric assessment, IHGA for short, and the idea was to train nurses to actually go into the homes of the elderly people and do a number of things, all of which sound pretty simple, but actually led to significant improvements, as you'll see in analyzing this data set. It turns out my wife is a gerontologist, and so which is a person who studies the social and medical aspects of aging. And it turns out, she tells me, it turns out that if you trace backwards from someone in old age, someone dying, to look back for a moment in the past before they were dead, when things went rapidly downhill for them, one of the sentinel events of that kind is a fall. You fall and break your hip, for example. They try to put a new hip in for you, but you don't actually take to it very well. You lose your mobility, you lose your will to live, and you die. It's a very rapid spiral. People die often 6 months to a year after the fall. So we've got to try to prevent these falls. And a simple way to do that is to come into the person's home or apartment and make sure that all the rugs in the whole place are nailed to the floor, right? So you don't want slip rugs giving rise to falls. Then when you get arthritic hands, for example, the doorknobs get hard to turn, and the knobs on the cabinets and so on. So you can retrofit the house so that it's possible to get around with it with arthritis, bad arthritis in your hands. And one of the biggest ones, particularly in America where they replicated this experiment, is something called polypharmacy. Many old people go to more than one doctor without telling each doctor that they're going to other doctors, and they end up getting 2 or 3 medicines from each doctor. And so if you go to an old person's medicine cabinet, there might be 9 or 10 pill bottles there, and none of the doctors know that this person's taking those other medicines. This is quite possible in the American healthcare system. It's not so easy in the Danish system, but some people were even doing it there. And this is terrible because people are often creating unintentionally a little war going on inside their body because some of the medicines are fighting with each other. Some of them are actually creating bad side effects when they're brought together. So the nurse would ask the person to bring out all his or her pill bottles and then completely re-rationalize their their medicine story. Bring them down from 10 medications down to 2 or 3. This is all very reasonable stuff. None of it could possibly hurt, pretty much. And so this is one of these things where it either doesn't do much at all or else it makes things better. And the question is, how much does it make things better? So they ran a randomized controlled trial. They got 572 elderly people who were chosen to be representative of the population of all non-institutionalized elderly people in Denmark in the early 1980s. And they randomized about half of them to a control group that got standard health care and the other half to a treatment group that got standard care plus the in-home geriatric assessment intervention. And they looked at a bunch of outcomes. One of them was the number of hospitalizations during the 2-year life of the study. The only data I'm going to show you in this particular case study is what I will call a benefit-only analysis. We're looking only at things like, did the hospitalizations go down? To really see whether the Danish government should do it or not, you need to perform a cost-benefit analysis in which you weigh the benefit to society and the Danish government in running their medical care for the country on the one hand against the cost of doing the in-home geriatric assessment. And I can tell you there that it turned out that it was not only beneficial from a benefit point of view, but also from a cost-benefit point of view. But I'm going to be showing you the benefit-only analysis. And it's always good. I used to work for a while at the think tank in Southern California called the RAND Corporation, and one of the old hands there said to me, when you're planning a study, a really good idea is to actually think about what the principal tables are going to look like in the results paper that you write, and actually create those table shells a year or two before you're even going to have the data to fill in those table shells. And so that's what I've done here. Looking ahead, without having seen the data yet, looking ahead to what the data will look like, the control group will have a bunch of counts for how many people had 0 hospitalizations, how many people had 1, and so on, up to the maximum number of hospitalizations anybody had, which I'll call K. And hospitalizations, I mean over the 2-year life of the study. And so you might have been lucky and had none at all. And the number of people in the control group that had no hospitalizations at all is called N sub C0 right there, and similarly for N sub C1 and so on. And then the treatment group similarly with N sub T0, N sub T1, and so on. The sample sizes, N sub C 287 in the control group, 285 N sub T in the treatment group, for a total sample size of little n of 572. And we can summarize things by the mean and the standard deviation as well. And they're going to be y bar C and y bar T for the means, and S sub C and S sub T for the standard deviations. That's really the basic table that's going to tell us whether this intervention is any good or not. And the unknown things in that table, we don't know what T is. We don't know what the N sub C I's are or the N sub T I's are. We don't know the y bars, and we don't know the S's at design time. But that's the stuff that we're going to be interested in. Now, as you know, the main purpose of running a trial like this is not just to find out how well things worked on the people in the trial. The main purpose is to try to generalize outward from the people in the trial to a larger universe. That's the idea of drawing an inference outward from the sample back to the population that you hope the sample was representatively chosen from. And fortunately, they ran things in such a way that these 572 elderly people were representative of the population of script P, I'll call it, of all non-institutionalized elderly people in Denmark. And so we're interested in y bar C and y bar T because they'll tell us something about how things went in the experiment, but we're really interested in their analogs in the population. So let's let mu sub C be the mean hospitalization rate for 2 years in the Danish population if no one had any in-home geriatric assessment at all over the 2-year period of the study. And let's let mu sub T be that same mean hospitalization rate if instead all the old elderly non-institutionalized people in Denmark had received the in-home geriatric assessment. Those numbers are very much unknown to us, and they will be unknown to us even after the data arrives. Once the data arrives, I can fill in all the N sub CIs and the N sub TJs and the Y bars and the S's. But at the end of that, we still don't know mu sub C and mu sub T. And those are the things of principal interest here. In other words, we're trying to draw inferences outward from the sample back toward the population in order to help the Danish government decide whether it would be a good thing to implement this intervention. Well, I like this case study a lot because almost everything we do as statisticians on a daily basis, all of that is encapsulated in this one study in the form of the following 4 questions. So first of all, question 1. Yes, please.
How do we know that we have a big enough sample?
The idea, in answering your question, when you're sitting around at design time, you haven't done the study yet, the idea will be to make some calculations to try to predict what the data set will look like and figure out what sample size is needed in order to be able to show that any differences that you see in the data probably might not have arisen just by random fluctuations. That's called a sample size calculation. I won't actually be talking about that in this course at the moment. I don't have any plans to, although that's something I can talk about toward the end of the class if people are interested in it. So we're going to assume here that Dr. Hendrickson and his statisticians did a sample size calculation and worked out that roughly 600 elderly people randomized into 2 groups of 300 was big enough to be able to correctly separate signal from noise. But I'm not going to show you those details. Very good question. The Bayesian answer to that question is complicated, actually. Bayesian experimental design should really be thought of as a decision problem, and the calculations involved in figuring out how much data to get for an optimal Bayesian design can get very complicated. But there are some simple things you can do from a Bayesian point of view as well, and maybe toward the end of the class I'll show you that stuff. That's a good idea. I'm going to make a note of that myself. Okay, so here come the 4 questions that arise from this study. Question 1, you're going to have a mean number of hospitalizations per 2 years in the in-home geriatric assessment group. That's Y bar T. You're going to have a mean number of hospitalizations per 2 years in the control group. That's Y bar C. Do those 2 means, sample means, differ by an amount that's large enough in practical terms to be worth continue pursuing the in-home geriatric assessment? And a good way to do that is to compare them in relative terms. So we use Y bar C as a kind of baseline, and we compute the relative change, Y bar T minus Y bar C over Y bar C. And that number multiplied by 100 will be a percentage change. And it turns out, like a bad comedian, I'll give away the punchline. It turns out, as we'll see later with this data, that quantity, Y bar T minus Y bar C over Y bar C, was minus 0.19. In other words, the intervention was associated with a 19% decline in mean hospitalizations per 2 years. And question 1 is a completely descriptive question because it's just talking about how the data actually came out. And it requires us to think as medical doctors and as health policy people, would a 19% change in hospitalizations, mean hospitalizations, be large enough to be worth bothering over? What do you guys think? If you could do something that didn't cost very much, that dropped hospitalization rates by almost 20%, would that be big enough to write home about? Definitely. And so we will be able to answer question 1 without doing anything fancy probabilistically. We're just going to look at Y bar C and Y bar T and compare them in relative terms, and it's going to turn out that 19% reduction in the sample. That's why it's a completely purely descriptive question, because it just says what's going on in the sample. Now, question 2 is much more ambitious, of course. Did in-home geriatric assessment cause a reduction in the mean number of hospitalizations per 2 years in the population that was large in statistical terms? And so that's an analogous question about those population means that goes along with the question about the sample means. And as you know, what is meant by a difference being large in statistical terms, another phrase for that is having the difference be statistically significant. And what that essentially means is that the difference rises above the background noise. We find a signal, and we are able to prove that the signal is larger than you would expect just based upon random fluctuations. That's a wholly different question. That's an inferential question. We're drawing inferences outward from the sample to the population. So question 1 involved description of the data itself without appeal to any generalization outward from it. Question 2 is all about generalizing outward from the sample to the population that it was chosen representatively from. Question 3 asks the following. On the basis of this study, how accurately can you predict the total decrease in hospitalizations over a period of, let's say, capital N years, if in-home geriatric assessment were implemented throughout Denmark? This is a policy question that the Danish government would like to know. If they did this IHGA thing on all elderly non-institutionalized people in Denmark, how many hospitalizations would be prevented? That's a predictive question. It's a kind of inferential question, but it's an inferential question about future data. And people use a different word for that. When your inference is about observable things, people call that a prediction problem. Whereas when your inference is about unobservable things, like the mu sub T and mu sub C that you're never going to really know because they are in the population and you haven't done the experiment on the whole population, that's called inference. So question 3 is yet a third thing that we often do in statistics. We try to predict the value of future data values that can be observed. And then question 4, and this is again a question for the Danish government, on the basis of this study, is the decision to implement IHGA throughout Denmark, is it optimal from a cost-benefit point of view? And that's yet a different activity, because here, questions 2 and 3 are what you might call scientific questions. They are trying to learn about how the world works without actually using that information to make a choice. Question 4 goes beyond that and actually tries to make a choice. Should the Danish government change the way that they're implementing health policy for elderly people in the whole country and implement in-home geriatric assessment for all elderly institutionalized people? That's a decision-making question. And there is an optimal Bayesian narrative for all 3 of those things: inference and prediction and decision. Bayes has nothing to say about description directly, and I won't be talking about description in this course. Description is an essentially non-probabilistic activity in which you simply draw pictures of the data that you have and make numerical summaries of the data that you have. And it is a fine and ancient art And it's a great thing to know how to do, but it's non-probabilistic, and it will not be the focus in this course. Now, an interesting thing, based at least on my 35 or so years of experience doing statistics, is that these questions encompass almost all of the entire discipline of statistics. We spend time describing data sets, call them capital D. We spend time generalizing outward inferentially from the data set D, to the population that you're really trying to learn about. We spend time predicting new data, which I'll call D star, and we spend time helping people make decisions in the presence of uncertainty. Now, if you think about all the stuff we actually do, there are some other things. And one of them is sampling design and experimental design. And this gentleman's question about sample size calculations, that's another example of what we do. I include all of that stuff under decision making, because it turns out that optimal sampling design and optimal experimental design are really decision problems. When you're choosing between one experimental design and another, you're making a choice. And you can use Bayesian decision theory to choose which is the optimal design. And also the same thing applies with sampling. Right, and so you're using the frequentist word power. Many of you in the room have heard probably the Neyman Pearson hypothesis testing story, and in which you, or maybe not, do we have a bunch of machine learners in the room who've never actually had any statistics? Is that true? Yeah, so there are some people like that. Well, back in the 1920s and 30s, these two guys, Neyman and Pearson, invented an approach to statistical hypothesis testing, where you compare two possible statements about how the world works vis-a-vis the population. And he's using a word called power, which is something they invented. It describes how likely you are to get the right answer as a function of how much data you have. And if you think about it from the metaphor of separation of signal from noise, if your sample size is really small, then you're going to make a lot of mistakes. You're going to incorrectly claim that there's signal when there's not, and you're also sometimes going to incorrectly claim there's not signal when there is. And so power has to do with what he's talking about. Making sure that you have high power is like saying, I have enough data to be able to pretty confidently say that when a signal appears in my data, it's a real signal and not a spurious one. Can you, having that background for your question, can you say your question again, please? I have forgotten your question.
I was wondering why it's
Ah. Oh, okay. And so the reason I'm including sampling and experimental design under decision making is that they are activities that occur before the data has arrived. You're sitting around at design time figuring out what to do. And you're right, you do, from a frequentist point of view, you think about things like power. And from a Bayesian point of view, you think about things like false positive and false negative error rates. You can formulate those actions on your part at design time as decisions. That's all I'm saying. So the idea of power turns out to be a special case of a way of thinking about Bayesian experimental design. Now, another important thing that we do that's not under my umbrella is what you might call data quality assurance. When I was at the RAND Corporation, the statisticians there, the old hands, used to say, we were in the health policy business, was the thing I did at RAND. We ran, for example, the biggest experiment I was involved with was something called the RAND DRG Quality of Care Study. That stands for Diagnosis-Related Groups, and it was a way that the Medicare system used to pay hospitals for treating Medicare patients. It was a $7.5 million study over 5 years, and we gathered millions of observations. You have to spend a lot of time making sure the data are of sufficiently high quality in order to actually spend some time on analyzing the data. And so I have no narrative about quality assurance, data quality assurance in this story here. That's missing from my umbrella right now. And in fact, the old hands at RAND used to say it would usually, they noticed in their career, it would usually take them about 90% of their effort to get the data into a form that could actually be intelligently analyzed, and only 10% of their time was spent doing the things that they were trained to do as statisticians in graduate school. 90% of your time was on stuff that you weren't trained to do, namely making sure the data is of good enough quality that you can actually count on being able to make reliable conclusions from it. So data quality assurance is not part of this umbrella, but and neither is description. But practically everything we do that we're going to be talking about in this course is under this umbrella. We're going to talk about how to do inference from a Bayesian point of view, how to do prediction, and how to do decision making. Those are our tasks. So if you got 100 statisticians together in a single room, and we almost did that today, there are many people in the world who would regard that as a rather frightening concept, getting 100 statisticians together in a single room. And you ask everybody what their definition of statistics was, to write it down on a piece of paper and pass it to the front of the room, and I read them all out. There's about 70 of us in the room today. You would find that there's qualitatively about 15 or 20 different answers. We could sort, some of them would be similar enough, we could sort them into piles, and we'd find 15 or 20 different piles. So everybody has a little bit different idea about what statistics is as a discipline. So I'll just give you my definition. For me, statistics is the study of uncertainty, how to measure it well, and how to make good choices in the face of it. And the measurement part brings in inference and prediction, and how to make good choices brings in decision. And so we are all about the business of quantifying uncertainty. And I'm going to talk in the next case study about 3 different definitions of probability, called the classical and the frequentist and the Bayesian definitions. And it will all be done in the context of a case study involving diagnostic screening for HIV. Back in the early to mid 80s, when AIDS first came about as something that was a tremendous health problem, public health problem, there were people who got up on the floor of the House of Representatives and said, recommended that every single person in America should be tested for HIV. And what this case study is going to show is that with the tools that were available in 1985, that would have been a really bad idea. And so that's what we're headed for. At the time, there were 2 blood tests that screened for HIV, and they still are used today, although they've gotten a lot better. They've been tuned better to separate signal from noise. One of them is called ELISA, and it's relatively inexpensive. It cost, in those days, cost about $20 a pop, and fairly accurate. And then there was a better thing that was almost a gold standard. It was called Western blot. It was about $100 a pop, but it was considerably more accurate. So let's say you, and I'm going to be using you with a capital Y here. This is a device that was invented by a wonderful statistician from Britain named Jack Good back in the 1950s. He was one of the guys who helped crack the German Enigma codes as part of that team of people at Bletchley Park who basically won the war over the Germans by using statistical methods to figure out how to crack the German secret communication codes. That's a story worth reading if you've never read it before. And it was a secret that he was involved with that for some time after the war, but then they finally allowed him to talk about it. Anyway, he had many good ideas, in fact, and he also had a high opinion of himself. He wrote a book called Good Thinking. And so he invented this idea called U with a capital Y. That represents a generic person wishing to reason sensibly in the presence of uncertainty. So I'm going to refer to this character called U with a capital Y throughout this course. And you can think of yourself when you see that, or you can think of me or someone else who's trying to cope with uncertainty and is a reasonable person and trying to do so in an intelligent, quantitative way. So let's say you are a physician and a new patient comes to you. Let's say the patient is male to have a pronoun, so he, this new patient comes to you with symptoms that suggest that he may be HIV positive. So already we have uncertainty. We are not sure whether the guy is HIV positive or not. And so here are some questions. Is it appropriate to use the language of probability, which is the part of mathematics that's involved in quantifying uncertainty? Is it appropriate to use the language of probability to quantify your uncertainty as the doctor and also the patient's uncertainty about the truth of the true-false proposition, capital A, which says this patient is HIV positive? Is it appropriate to use the language of probability to do that? The answer is going to turn out to be yes. If so, what kinds of probability are appropriate? It's going to turn out, as I said, that 3 different kinds of probability have been invented, the so-called classical and frequentist and Bayesian approaches to probability. So if so, which of those 3 kinds of probability are appropriate? And how would you assess the probability that A is true in each case? And that is something that I'll address as well. It turns out that all 3 kinds of probability are capable of either that task or something rather similar to it. And then as a decision sort of question, what strategy as a doctor should you employ to decrease your uncertainty and the uncertainty of the patient about the truth of this proposition? In particular, you have available to you ELISA or Western blot or both or neither. And so those are essentially the four possible decisions. You could, that's one way to characterize the action space, as it's called, of possible decisions. You could just run ELISA, or you could just run Western blot, or you could run them both, or you could run neither. And actually, it's going to turn out that there are other possibilities as well. You could do something adaptive. You could run one test first, and depending on how it came out, you could choose to run the other test or not. So the action space is actually a bit more complicated than just those four possibilities. But basically, that's the sort of questions I want to address. And if you decide to run a screening test, which we're going to, how should your uncertainty be updated in light of the new data? So basically, this is the paradigm in which we're learning from the world. We have a certain state of uncertainty at the moment, and then new data arrives, and we need to update that uncertainty in light of the new information. We hope that our uncertainty has decreased, and it is very likely that the data, if the test, for example, is any good, it's very likely that the data will change our probabilistic assessment of the truth of that proposition. How much does it change, and how should you make the change in a way that's logically internally consistent? That's what we're heading for now. The systematic study of probability, it turns out, doesn't go back very far in the history of ideas. We have been thinking carefully about mathematics as a species for about 4,000 years. The Babylonians were about 2000 BC, were the first people to invent a system for writing down integers. And also they actually had a system, once they had a system for writing down integers, they used that system to write down fractions as well. So the Babylonians, 4,000 years ago, invented, so to speak, the concept of integers, only positive integers, and rational numbers, ratios of integers. And then they began to study the properties of these things. So we've actually been thinking intelligently about mathematics for about 4,000 years, and yet it wasn't until about 350 years ago, including not the ancient Greeks, not the ancient Persians, not the ancient Indian peoples, not all these peoples that did great mathematics. None of them thought about uncertainty quantification. It wasn't until about the year 1650 that people started to think seriously about this. And the reasons for that are interesting. The Greeks never thought about it because for them it would have been something that was basically sacrilegious to talk about. What we would now call chance or haphazardness was something that was regarded by the Greeks as in the hands of the gods. And so to even talk about guessing at what the gods were going to do and placing quantitative assessments next to those possible guesses would have been regarded as a kind of blasphemy on the part of the Greeks. So it took a mindset that in which uncertainty was divorced from religion to get to the point where people could begin to think about it. And the first people who thought about it were the great French mathematicians Pascal and Fermat. I mention also to you a wonderful book that you might like at the end of this story here. Let's see if the end button works. There's some references, and so there's a book called Statistical Inference from this guy Michael Oakes, and that's another book that would be very much worth your attention. He has a big history of probability in it, and then he has lots of ideas about what's good and bad about the frequency and the Bayes paradigms. So let's get back to home and get back to where I was a minute ago. Hey, wrong button. So Pascal and Fermat, the story is actually interesting. They were working on other kinds of math, but they had a friend. He was a guy called the Chevalier de Marais. He was a rich guy nobleman in the court of the king of France at that time, and he had too much money and too much time on his hands, and he liked to gamble a lot, and he liked to invent new gambling games. And he discovered quickly that when he went to someone and said, I've invented a new gambling game, would you like to play? That most people said no, because they didn't understand how to play the game in a way that was to their advantage. After all, he was the guy who invented the game, right? So he went to Pascal and Fermat and said, oh, you smart guys, what if I give you some money and in return you invent a mathematics of gambling for me so that I can analyze these games myself and we can all be better gamblers? And so Pascal and Fermat, sort of one of history's first grant applications or grant proposals, so to speak. Pascal and Fermat took the money and they invented a version of probability that was suitable for thinking about games of chance of the kind this guy was thinking about, which had to do with things like rolling dice and tossing coins and drawing cards from a deck of cards and drawing colored balls from urns, the sort of stuff that we hear about in elementary school when we first start hearing about probability. This is now called the classical approach, and it works as follows. You think about you imagine the thing you're interested in, for example, rolling a pair of dice, and counting the sum of the spots that appear on the dice that are the faces that are up. And so you could get a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or so on all the way up to a 12, for example, right? So you try, those are called elemental outcomes, or they might be elemental outcomes. Anyway, they're the ways that the experiment could come out. And you try to enumerate the elemental outcomes in a way that makes them what we now call equipossible. And you'll notice that's a squirmy sort of word. You want to try to say equiprobable or equally probable, but you can't because you're using the word probability in the definition of probability, and that's a no-no. So the idea was to make these elemental outcomes equipossible, meaning that there's no reason why one of them should be favored over the other on grounds of, for example, symmetry. And so here's an example of a very simple example of what I mean by equipossible. Okay, there we are. I have a little, funny, it seems like it gets stuck sometimes. I have a little, a little fake population of numbers with a 1 and a 2 and a 9 in it. And I'm going to take one number out of that population at random and call that number y1. And I want to use the classical approach to work out the probability that y1 is an odd number. And so here, Pascal and Fermat would say, well, the elemental outcomes in your experiment are the numbers 1, 2, and 9. And they have been made equipossible by the phrase at random. If you thought for some reason that the 1 was more possible than the 2 or the 9, I could show you were wrong by relabeling them. I could call the 1 the 2, and now all of a sudden you'd think that the 2 was the one that was more possible. So as soon as I point that out to you, you notice on symmetry grounds that the phrase at random has made those 3 outcomes equipossible. And then they said to themselves, okay, now it's just counting and creating a rational fraction. The denominator is how many elemental outcomes there are, and the numerator is how many of them are favorable to the thing you're interested in. So obviously 2/3 here. So no one had ever done that before. That was actually pretty good technology for the year 1650. And so that's what they did. And I see that we have come to the moment for our first break, and so I will break. So now we'll stop, and for 15 minutes you can wander around, check your email, go to the bathroom, whatever, and I'll start again promptly at 10:15.